Hello, everyone. We are here, and Jordan is going to be here in a minute. I think he mistook the actual time before the podcast was starting. Here he is.
Very good. I'm still at 6:59. Something's off here. Anyway, welcome. Glad you're joining, and it's good to be here again. Anyway, okay, let's get started. Tonight we are back, obviously from a break, and a little bit of a break in the routine as well. But episode 238, right? I'm right on that this time. Okay. So tonight, the topic came from a few different conversations over the last couple of weeks, actually. One of which you and I had, I think it was last week. But the question, or the topic is a question: what is a real man? And so I was talking to my wife about a couple of different things the other day, and she had mentioned that she was having a conversation with somebody at her job, and he's a young guy, and he's a young guy who was talking about men in America being, or us in America, not actually specific to men, but men and women in general, being very sensitive and not really being able to handle a lot and getting offended easily. He talked about that. And so he stated this quote, and I've heard the quote before. I don't know if we said on here, maybe we just talked about it in conversation, but the quote is: hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. And then so this is actually, this quote originally comes from a novel, and I've never read the novel, but I just pulled the rest of the quote to try and get a little bit more context. But the second part of this, he actually says a little bit more than that. He says, many will not understand it, but you have to raise warriors, not parasites. And so simply it illustrates that the idea that there are different kinds of men. And I'm going to talk a lot, I'm going to ask a lot more about specific to men in general, but I think you could probably apply this a little bit more, across the genders. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be man or specific man or woman, but just talking about the idea of being a real man or being a real woman. And so when we talk about things in this podcast, we often talk about things quite exclusively. And you use the word a lot, life's not binary. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to some topics, they are binary. This is how things are meant to be. And although in the world we live in, the lines are very blurred, but God clearly said truth is truth. And he shows us that truth by itself is truth. And everything he said is truth. There's nothing that you can put in there or interject to make it something that it's not. It's just, it is what it is. So God made a man, and obviously he made man with some intention behind this creation, what he was supposed to be, how he's supposed to act, and how he's supposed to respond to life no matter how life changes, right? And so the question tonight really is, what is a real man? So since you are and I don't mean this in way of jest, I mean this quite literally and more honorably than it might come out, you are of the aged class of people in the world nowadays, and so you've seen a lot more life than somebody my age has, and you come from a different era than I do. And now I'm having conversations with guys. I actually played pickleball with a couple guys who are quite a bit younger than me, and they're saying things and acting in ways that I'm like, wow, that's very youthful. I don't know how else to explain it. It wasn't that they were like, surpassing me in some way, or I felt like disconnected. It was just I was seeing youth in a mature way. Does that make sense? Like I was kind of relating to them more as a guy who's an older guy to a younger guy, but I was seeing them as men, but young men. Does that make sense? I'm trying to communicate that in such a way that's
kind of. I mean, when you say you see them as young men, I think that's kind of what we're talking about tonight. What does that mean?
Yeah. So, but I wasn't seeing them as kids. In other words, I was seeing them as men.
But you're talking about from the standpoint of age as opposed to anything else,
Right.
as far as maturity levels or
Correct.
things
Yeah.
like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm saying all that to lead into this first question is, when you were growing up, and if you were to look back and just kind of analyze how men were when you were younger, have men changed from the time you were young looking at men to the time now you're older looking at men, younger men of that age?
Well, it's hard to it's the short answer is yes, but the long answer is everything has changed. It's not, so it's like of necessity, you know, men have changed, because it's a whole different universe. I mean, things have changed so much. I mean, even just in the last 5 years, things have changed with COVID, and the whole something. It's funny because being in my 60s, well, late 50s, when COVID hit, I had a lot of life experience, and I had probably more life experience than a lot of people because I had the opportunity to be able to live in different parts of the world, and started doing that at a fairly young age, and so. Um, so I'm trying to think of a way of putting it into perspective, but the idea of men changing, yes, men have changed. I don't think, in a sort of evolutionary conversation, that men have changed, in terms of, how the things that we see, like you said, I agree with that idea that it's cyclical, that we're heading towards a time where, so when I was my experience when I was younger, my dad was, my family wasn't wealthy, and so my dad was, starting a company, and then the company became a success, and then we moved, and so I was raised without money, and then right towards the end of my teenage years, like the last 3 years, all of a sudden we had money. We went from having a house in California, in Los Angeles, with no swimming pool, and so it's like really hot, and so, and going from that to Tucson, Arizona, living in an upper middle class area of town, everybody has a swimming pool in our neighborhood, and so being able to go through all that, I've had a lot of good life experience for that. Not everybody has that, but if you so the point that I'm really making about all this is that I don't think men have changed from the standpoint of the physiological elements. I don't think they have changed mentally. Yeah, mentally, but not permanently. Mentally, men have changed. But I think, and that's why I mentioned about the fact of growing up a certain way, is that, I think a lot of people today are part of that last 2 or 3 years of my growing up in my parents' house. Is more prosperity. There's a lot more prosperity. Actually, I don't even know if I'd say there's a lot more prosperity, as much as there's a lot more spending. Where you didn't spend yourself into huge debt. When I was young, that was a stupid idea. But today, now, if you're going to have what other people have, the mentality is, then you have to spend yourself into debt. And so that creates a way of thinking that you're going to have a hard time being successful, because only the successful people have the ability to wait, for things. And so what I think we're seeing, over time, is a lot of stuff that's happening is part of that cycle that you're talking about, is that you have these soft men, whose fathers were hard men. They were go-getters, and they prospered, but their sons were not like that. Their sons didn't follow that flow, and now they have children, and their children are, they don't have good reference points, because their parents don't have good reference points. Their parents did have good reference points from their parents, but they've abandoned those reference points for today's world. And so now you have, a lot of that has gone by the wayside. Is the family, and it's probably different in different parts of the world, I'm sure, but in America, I think it's probably held together better because it's taken longer for family values to fall apart. They're still decaying, but that framework is still there, family values, and so there is some things that are being handed down still, but so my point in that is just simply that I think that once those kids, which my hope is, because I'd like to see it while I'm alive. My hope is that what is referred to as the Gen Z generation becomes that generation that says, hey, we need to get our act together. Maybe not Gen Z, but whatever they're calling it, Gen A or whatever, starting over again. But I'm talking. So I'm talking your, I don't know, 5 to 15-year-olds of today, that age group probably. My hope is that they'll be the ones to say, hey, you know what, we need to start looking at life a little bit more seriously and being willing to pay the price. Maybe not, maybe they won't do it, but I think that's what you're seeing is that just that unwillingness to pay the price. But I wouldn't say that there was ever a generation that was willing to pay the price. I think they didn't have a choice.
Okay, so that actually is perfect into my next question, is because I was going to ask. I've heard that men aren't born, they're made, and so is that true? Are men not? They're not born. It's something.
No, it's not a no. You're. It's not exclusively a product of your environment, but your environment plays into it a lot. And the kind of person you are has a lot to do with your life experience, and your life experience has a lot to do with your family background, and so these things all go, they all follow together. And so when it comes to the idea of manhood, when you're talking about genuine manhood, I think we're talking about something that has not so much lost its definition as much as it's lost its example. I think that's really the issue is that most people know what a real man should be like, but the example of that is not there. And also you have those that, are opposing, old values anyway. I mean, and so they're, regardless of what those values are. And so you have those two things working together. But it's funny, every now and then you'll see something on the news, you'll see something of somebody somewhere who will say, you know what, I'm so done with the way things are going,
Yeah.
and they'll be the innovator, of things, and I don't want this, I'm not going to just kick the can down the road. I want to, to innovate. I don't want to just simply, scrape together, the crumbs of past generations, and have there's a genuine desire to achieve, that's working within them. And so I think to answer the question, have men changed? I would say the mental toughness is probably been derailed. I would say that, probably more than anything else, that mental toughness has been derailed. And so the idea of really sticking at a thing and really being, being able to work through difficulties is not as easy, because they're not as equipped mentally.
So a question came in that I think is a great question. And the question is, what do you think of the quote, bad times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create bad times?
You just mentioned that.
That's why I think it's a great question. Yeah, so that was part of my intro, actually. So you can answer the question again if you want.
Well, I have been, from
Yeah.
the standpoint of us being, being cyclical, because at some point, there's going to be nothing left to extract out of the world. You're not going to, there's going to be no pie left. And somebody's going to have to make a pie. You can keep cutting the pie in half, forever, but at some point, there's going to be no pie left, or no pie worth having. And somebody's going to have to make a new pie, and there are people that have done that. But it's interesting, if you think about it, because, you think about, if you just talk about the '80s, just generally speaking, you talk about the '80s. And I'm not saying that that's a great time or anything like that, but the '80s was a time. The '60s were the same way. As the '60s, there was times of innovation, and the '80s were a time of innovation, but then you did see, every 20 years you do get some measure of innovation, but it's interesting just to see how things are going, and there's a lot of 50-somethings right now that are really thinking about the next wave of innovation. And it's not everybody, but there are people who are thinking about it. And so it's interesting. And when that gets down into the 20s and 30s, I don't, I'm careful. I'm careful not to try to pick up the stereotype of, kids these days, stereotype, because I think, it becomes more difficult to achieve things when wealth keeps going up. Is that when I was younger, the idea of billionaires, that was, very rare, very, very rare. And now there's billionaires are like, oh, billionaires, if you're not 100 billionaire, then, what are you? And stuff like that, so there's a lot of, this has always been the case, but there's a lot of market cornering and, and gaming the system so that other people are not allowed to succeed. There's not room, there's a lot of grabbing, going on, and in bigger businesses. You look at companies like Apple and not so much Microsoft anymore, but if you look at, I would say maybe Nvidia would be another good example, is these companies that really are trying to stifle the market. They're not just thinking about innovation. They're stifling the market. They're actually making it difficult. So the game has changed to where it's more about making it difficult for other people to compete, as opposed to being successful. It's more about how do you keep other people from competing, and so that you can hang on to more of the pie, kind of a thing. Whereas, two guys in their garage make a computer. I don't think two guys in a garage can make anything anymore. Because when you look at the chips that were used in the garage, these chips were relatively huge. They could be soldered on with a soldering iron. Now everything's so micro-sized that everything requires special machinery now. I was watching a YouTube video on a motherboard repair, and the technique to be able to take these chips off, and what they were repairing an Apple board, and so you got to be careful with this because there's this and that and the other thing you need to watch out for. But then there's the fact that you can do the repair job perfectly and it may still not work. You may turn on the switch and it still doesn't work. And the reason is because when it turns on, there's magic. I'm saying that because I don't want to go into the technical things. There's magic that needs to happen. And if that magic doesn't happen, it will blow the chip. And so that's it. Now you have to just take the chip off and put another on, try it again. And this is something that's very, very difficult. And the more that you try to do it, the better the chances are of you screwing it up. And so they had this new guy. He said first time he'd ever tried to do this. One guy gave him a 45% chance of being able to repair the board. Another one gave him 20% chance on his first go. So the chances were he was going to fail, and he did it perfectly. He absolutely did it perfectly. The other two guys were upping their, you're at 98% now. This is, you've done a great job, and you did everything clean, you did everything right. And so sure enough, and then they turn it on and they're looking, and they go, oh, it looks like it's working, And that was it. And they had to take the chip off, because the chip blew up. And so what I'm saying is that, when you're talking about men, men being real men, we can get into the idea of personality afterwards, but it's a lot harder to be innovative. And that's my point, is it's a lot harder to be innovative. And because it's a lot harder to be innovative, it's not so easy to see the possibility of you being anything valuable, and that really is the difficulty. Is you see this stuff going on and you think, where can I jump in where I can be valuable? Because you look at it, I don't, when I was younger, and I'm only using when I was younger simply because of how short of a period of time it is, not how long of a period of time that this has happened. But when I was younger, the idea, they used to tell you in school, anybody can be president. And that was literally what you were taught. This is one of the great things about our country, is anybody can become president of the United States. But it was realistic that anybody, because you would see it. You would see these people that would come into, but now it seems like almost every politician prior to becoming a politician was a lawyer. And so you're talking about expensive degrees, to get a degree as a lawyer. So you're talking about privileged class now. You're not just talking, because not everybody's going to be able to go to school and become a lawyer in order to become a politician. And you're not going to just show up, and be able to tangle with these, with these educated lawyers who can talk circles around you and know how the game's played, and they can, and there's a lot of other things in there where just showing up and wanting to do something is not, that doesn't mean anything anymore. Just showing up and wanting to do something. During my upbringing, the idea of having a degree was something that was generally looked at as an optional thing. You could still be amazing without a degree. And there are a lot of people to prove that, because you have these people like Bill Gates and others who dropped out and started making loads of money, and had successful careers without having, that education. And then others that, there's a lot. I could mention a lot of them. Many of them had, less than adequate education, but they got a degree. But they weren't high flying students or anything like that. And so my point in all that, again, is just the idea that just showing up is not enough. There's a lot of opposition to the idea of being something, in this life now, today. It's much harder to be something. And I'm glad that I don't, and this might be a little bit cynical, but I'm glad that I'm not young enough to have to work for a company, because it's so many companies are just thankless jobs.
Yeah.
They're just thankless jobs, because it is the only thing that the company is in. When I was younger, we were taught, so I, again, keep things in balance. I was taught that every business is in business to make a profit. Mm-hmm. But what that meant is different from today, because now businesses are in it only to make a profit. It doesn't matter what they make. So a lot of the things, because the idea is the things you were told, I was told, is quality, personability, these kinds of things, where now those rules are all gone. No, it's dog eat dog. It's, kill or be killed. It's this the survival of the fittest. It's all these kinds of things now that have replaced character, and integrity. The character and integrity has been replaced with ruthlessness,
Yeah.
and cruelty in some places. And so I'm just kind of painting the picture here of what, to talk about, what is a real man. You have to first talk about the environment that a man has to live in before you
So-
can actually talk about it. Because I was actually thinking about it earlier, because I knew what the title was going to be, and so I thought, could I simplify? Could I simply say a man is X? And I could not narrow it down to one thing, for sure.
Yeah.
I was able to narrow it down to a couple of things, but there was no way I was going to be able to just narrow it down
So
to one
let
thing.
me pitch some questions that might kind of draw that out, because my next question was going to be because I could have made the title "What is a good man,"
Yeah.
but I felt like that was a little bit too
Yeah.
small to think about. But a real man is a little bit, I mean, just more of a
Yeah.
punch anyway. But the idea though of a good man is kind of what I was thinking, because ask 10 different people what a good man is, you might actually get 10 different answers. And so how would you describe, a good man? Okay, what would be the
good man.
characteristics that you would describe
Yeah.
a good
Well,
man?
a good man, that's actually harder to describe, because now we have to define what it means to be good. And so now you're talking about situationally, because good is good in different places. A good husband is not the same as a good CEO,
Right.
which is why so many CEOs are divorced. Is because being a good CEO doesn't those things don't filter down into every area of life. And that, which is the point that I'm trying to make, is that idea. And so the idea of a good man, that's a
Wait, so are you
that's a
saying
difficult-
are you saying you can't be a good husband and a good CEO at the same
No,
time?
I'm not saying that you can't be a good husband and a good CEO, but what I'm saying is that being a good husband is a different
Type of
definition than a good
Right.
CEO.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay.
They're different definitions. A good CEO is not a good husband by default.
Right. Gotcha.
And a good
Gotcha.
husband is not a good CEO by
Right.
default. There's so much, in between there. And that's what I'm talking about, because of the way things have, grown, over the years, you find that anybody who wants to make their mark in this life, really, the more that they want to make their mark in this life, the more strain it puts on their family. It's not like you can do both, but you have to, if you want to be a good man. So now you're talking about, if you want to be a good man, then your target cannot be to be a good CEO, or I should say the best CEO. Your target cannot be to be the best husband. You have to, because there will, by definition, there will have to be compromises. In your pursuits, you can't give all yourself to being a CEO, and that automatically works out into being
Right.
a good husband. And so that's what I'm saying. So I use those two because they're so distinctly different. The goals are completely different. And like I said, that they are, you see some. It seems to be that if you're a good CEO, then you're probably not going to be a good husband. And if you're a good husband, you're probably not going to be a good CEO. And they're somewhat mutually exclusive. And it's funny, because I've seen that over the years as when my wife and I, when we're younger and we're having kids and I'm just working a job, I don't have a lot of responsibility. I can be home a lot. I can be home with the kids. I can help raise, I say I can help raise the kids, but that conjures up weird ideas in people's minds of sharing the the responsibilities and the duties. That's not what I mean when I say that, because it's not about sharing the responsibilities and doing that. My wife has her motherhood and I have my fatherhood, and we do that together. And so, but it's not by her being part mother, part father, and me being part mother, part father. It's not like that. But the but when I was younger, it was a lot easier too, price wise, expense wise. I could work a job not making a lot of money, and that in the earlier days of our lives, we were managing apartments, so I had a free apartment. Well, now being an apartment manager, I mean, there was only like 20 apartments. It wasn't very many apartments, and I had a free apartment, and I mean free. Everything was free. Utilities, everything was free. The whole thing was free. I just had to buy food. And so, try to find a gig like that today. Good luck. If you're going to find something like that today, no chance. Because, well, shoot, we can, there's plenty of people who need jobs, and so we can just have you work, as the property manager, and you have a mobile phone, so we don't have to give you a house, to live in. You've got a mobile phone. They can just call you, and you can just come over.
Yeah.
And we don't even need to give you a mobile phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Use your phone.
So
so again, the point that I'm making is the idea of what it means to be good and all that kind of stuff is everything is involved is becoming more difficult to do that.
Yeah. So but again, interesting, because you're like, you're talking a lot about environment here, and I actually put a couple thoughts down here because I'm, to be honest with you, I'm taking notes as you're saying things that are provoking other questions, and so you're talking about in the influence of environment for people in different situations.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like in order to be a good man, you would need to be able to adapt appropriately to the change of environment or situation.
Well,
So
that's
could you maybe describe either in whole or in part the mentality that a good man would need to have in order to be successful in the environment?
That's
situation?
kind of what I'm leading to, is the idea you've used the word that I'm working towards, is that a real man is a man who's able to adapt. So the thought that came into my mind in just thinking about this idea from a biblical standpoint was the first thought that came into my mind was the idea of, generally of responsibility and being responsible. But then right after that, I thought about, how do you define that? And it's different for different people in different walks of life. And so, I think to be a real man, when you're talking about being a real man, as opposed to a boy that is not a mental boy but a physical adult. The idea, the difference, I think, is the ability to adapt. When it comes right down to it, is being adaptable. So because I don't think I mentioned in the scriptures, he who swears to his own hurt and changes not.
Yeah.
In other words, somebody who's willing to throw their hat in the ring. They're willing to commit, and then when that commitment becomes difficult, they're able to adapt as necessary in order to fulfill that commitment, or modify the commitment to something more reasonable, because maybe the commitment that you made is unrealistic and you need to modify. But can you modify without quitting? Just, okay, forget it. I'm not doing this anymore, and just quit. And so the idea of being able to adapt, to situations, and because I think that is really, kids can adapt when it's out of necessity, but they don't want to adapt. And anybody who's had children knows what I'm talking about. Is that it's time to go to bed. I don't want to go to bed. And if they can fight, to not go to bed, then they will fight. And if they win and don't go to bed, then they're happy, but they don't like it, and then when you go into their room in the morning and you try to wake them up, they don't want to get out of bed, and so this is what I'm talking about when I talk about that idea of adapting is not, you have no choice, and so you just roll with the punches, because kids can do that, when they don't have a choice, they can adapt very quickly when there's no choice involved. But when you're an adult, you always have a choice. And so that's really the issue, is being able to adapt in whatever situations you're in, and still be able to maintain, a level of responsibility and commitment.
Yeah.
And I would say that would be probably, the most narrow definition that I can give of what it means to be a real man, is somebody who's adaptable, but also is adaptable, responsible, and willing to commit. Is I think probably the most narrow definition that I can give of a man.
So when you're, and you've mentioned a lot of this already, kind of alluded to it, is the idea of pursuits, and it sounds like when you're kind of just working your way through the Bible, that clearly what a man pursues, at least in my opinion, that clearly what a man pursues is going to determine what kind of man or woman someone is going to be, right? Is that a fair statement? That your pursuits determine what kind of person you are?
Sort of, not entirely, because you're, like you have kings that are good kings and kings that are bad kings, but they were all kings,
Right.
and they were all, becoming kings or pursuing kings. I mean, the way that you're using the word, I don't think you mean it as an aggressive thing,
No.
as much as just where you go in life,
Yeah.
where
Yeah,
life
yeah.
takes you. And so I would say that, I'd say there's a, there's a, it's a, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I don't think
So
it's right across the board.
mainly what I'm after is like, how does a man's desire determine his adaptability? So you're in a different situation, if you have
that's such a large area, because you don't have just one desire. You have lots of desires, and
Right.
so to make one rule for a million different desires is real difficult. I don't see a way to actually do that.
If you were to describe the right pursuit for a man, and when I say pursuit, I mean it in the sense that, like, this is what I'm after in life. How do you? Because the truth is, like, you can split this in multiple pieces. You could talk about being successful in the world, being a good man in the world. You talk about innovation, riches, or wealth, and success from a worldly perspective. But it's that doesn't sound like what Christians generally pursue. I mean, obviously
Yeah,
they don't
so
toss
so
that
this
to the
is getting
curb,
back. Yeah, this is getting back to that idea of the split world theology, which I just don't agree with. Is the idea that there's a secular world and a spiritual world, and neither shall the two overlap. And I just don't buy into that kind of thinking, is because, it was the spirit that created the physical. So it's like, you don't have a physical without the spiritual. If there was no spiritual, there'd be no physical. And it was the spiritual that made the physical. And so the two are not, they're not, separated from each other. And so the idea of, Christian pursuits versus worldly pursuits isn't, I could probably give an argument for everything that is considered to be a worldly pursuit of how it's not, how it could not be worldly, that it would be a Christian pursuit. It's because it.
So basically, the question I'm
usage
asking
of
is,
it,
what determines the difference between it being a good or bad pursuit? If you can look
well,
at
being
the
good or
same
bad
thing,
doesn't mean worldly or spiritual.
Right.
That's that again. That's that idea. That's that split worlds thing. To quote the Animal Farm book. A world bad. Spiritual good. It's not that cut and dry. And that's, I think about it and I think as a Christian, my job as a Christian, even as a pastor, my job is not telling people about Jesus. I'm trying to think of a way of describing that. My job is not, I should be doing this all day, every day, all day long, telling people about Jesus, telling people about Jesus, telling people about Jesus. Because that's not how God didn't create the world like that. He didn't create the world so that people, have all these amazing opportunities to just spend their entire day, telling people about Jesus. And so there is a purpose, in life. Everybody has a purpose, and those purposes are not just to tell everybody about Jesus. Are we facilitating that? Yes, we're facilitating that. But the direct idea of this, it's just about telling people about Jesus. It's not like that. My daughter has, boys, 4 boys, and they've moved. They're pastors starting a church. Well, they're a family, and they don't have a lot of, they're just starting a church, so they don't have a lot of services and events and things like that to go to. So they have time, and the kids can be involved in sports. And so the kids are involved in sports. But my daughter is not a soccer mom. She looks like she could be, because she's always doing like soccer moms do. But in the middle of all that, these people that they got to know, now are part of their church. They've become Christians. They've told them about Jesus, and they've gotten saved. So they're bringing this together. So it's not just a thing of no, just tell people about Jesus. Just forget about everything else in life. Having their kids in sports. Now there'd be what would be the point of having your kids in sports? And you say, okay, now don't worry about being good in sports. You're just there to tell them about Jesus. So when your coach gets on you about not being able to play your position very well, you don't listen to him. Because you're only there to tell people about Jesus. How long is that going to last? How much opportunity they're going to have when you're making the team lose every game. How many kids are going to listen to you about Jesus? Yeah. Or the parents. When the parents are defending their kid. Oh no, we're Christians. We don't have to go to. I don't want them to be focused on winning the game. I want them to be focused on telling people about Jesus. And so that may sound like heresy to some people, but the reality is that you're going to do a lot more good for the kingdom of God by being able to be good in the world. When I say good, I mean that people in the world can look at you and say, you're not wrecking the place. I remember when I first came here, I didn't take seriously the idea of a lot of the things. I'm not from California. I'm from Tucson, Arizona, and I've grown up outside of the United States. And so the idea of climate change was never a serious idea. The idea of recycling and, taking care of the planet and all that kind of stuff. It was just not, it didn't work in my surroundings where I was, different situations that I was in. People were more concerned about other things than recycling. I've been in countries that are, they're just trying to survive, let alone recycle. And so I get here, and I'm working on my job, and my boss, because they know I'm a pastor, my boss right away, okay, tell us about this. Tell us about, what you're doing and stuff like that. Gave me an open opportunity at lunch one day to tell everybody at the table about, why I'm a pastor, what is religion to me, and all this kind of stuff. So I'm telling them all, telling them about Jesus, how they need to be saved, about God, and my testimony and what happened in my life. And I was walking somewhere, and I think I had an orange peel or something in my hand, and I turned around and I just chucked it in a bush. And one of the people said, "You're a Christian?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you think that that's a good thing to do? Throw your trash into a bush?" And I said, "Well, it's an orange peel." He's like, "Yeah, but what if everybody just did that? Kind of a thing. What if everybody just it's just the orange peel? So it's biodegradable, so I can just throw it in the middle of the street." And I looked at him and I said, "The good thing about being a Christian is that I know this world's all going to burn anyway." Well, that didn't score me any points at all. In fact, it was like, "Oh, you know what? Don't tell me about your Christianity thing. You Christians are all the same. You don't care about this life. You only care about the next one." And I thought about that later on. I thought, that was not a good idea. That was not a good idea for me to say that. I need to, and so I have tailored, my thinking about that, because people do care about this stuff that people care about. And if I want to be able to tell them about something more important than what they're into, then I have to be sensitive to what they're into. or I'm not going to be able to tell them about what's more important. And so this is the point that I'm making when it comes to the idea of, being in the world, and and having these clearly defined boundaries between the spiritual and the worldly. It just doesn't. That's not realistic, And so being good at your job and being promotable, that's a good thing, for Christianity. That's not a bad thing. And if you're working at a company that is sympathetic towards something, that is, not even on the radar of the church, well, you treating it like garbage isn't. You're never going to be able to tell them about what's more important.
Yeah.
And that's the idea. That's the point that I'm wanting to make is that if we want to start talking about being a Christian man, a real Christian man, it's not just reading your Bible, praying, and going to church. You have to be able to interact with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Your attitude is, I don't want to be here anymore, and you present that to everybody that you're around, that you don't want to be on this planet anymore. Good majority of the people you're going to talk to aren't going to listen to you because they want to be on this planet, and it's important to them to be on this planet. And so you might where you where you would do very well with people who don't want to live on this planet anymore, which isn't a lot of people. As people who've given up on life. And so that's going to be your harvest field, is people who've given up on life. They've given up and they quit life. And so that's going to be your harvest field. And that's a very, very small harvest field, because there's not a lot of people like that, and you might think, oh, well, those are the people that are going to, they're going to go to heaven. He goes, well, I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think heaven's going to be filled with, a population of people who, man, I'm so glad to be here. I hated Earth. Just don't think that's going to be the case, especially because God created the earth.
Yeah. Okay, so you said something a while back, earlier in the podcast, that it's a lot harder in certain environments today or situations to for a man to believe he can be anything.
Yeah.
And so
so it's more important to be adaptable.
Yeah. So now, where does that belief that you can become something come from? Where does that?
Well, this is a hard one, because we can become discouraged. Okay, say your question again, because I might want to just answer that directly.
So when you mentioned it's a lot harder for in today's environment to believe you can be anything. Yeah. Where does the desire to be something come from?
Okay, where does the desire to be something come from? So
I'm sorry, not the desire, the belief that you can be something.
Okay, where does the belief that you can be something comes from? Well, so I was, because what I was thinking about before was more about the idea of not so much believing that you can be something as much as formulating a something that's easy to be. Because that is a possibility. You can look at everything and see how difficult it is to do that or that or that over there. But, this is much easier, and there are people that how to describe them. They haven't done anything with their lives, but they talk a lot about doing things, but they haven't actually done anything, but they talk a lot about it. And I think they've convinced themselves that is doing something, being able to talk from a professional or an expert point of view, about things that you actually haven't done is an achievement. Which it's not, because you've just convinced yourself to that something. So when you talk about the idea of where does the idea of believing come from in yourself, that's a hard question to answer, because.
So what you're saying is the belief might not actually be
real.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not real. It's fabricated.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fabricated. So that's what makes it difficult. Is you might actually believe because you've convinced yourself of something, and because you've convinced yourself of something, this is one of the things that I think Christians need to be very, very careful of, is that they believe that God has a plan and a purpose for their lives that is very easily defined, and that like you become a Christian, you give your life to Jesus, and then part of that is like a welcome packet, that God gives you this welcome packet of things. He gives you a Bible. He gives you instruction. He gives you a pastor. He gives you a church to be in, and so this is like your welcome packet. And then along with that is oh, by the way, here's your destiny. This is what you're going to be in the future. And so now all you have to do is, like I said, like a welcome packet, like an orientation packet when you're starting a job. They give you this, and so you just go home and read all that material, and you'll know what your job is. And that may work for some jobs. But it doesn't work for jobs where you actually have to achieve something, beyond what the company's already doing, and so that idea of destiny, is often, mistaken, I think, by many who become Christians, with the idea of thinking that if you become a Christian, God has a destiny for your life. Because we say it a lot as Christians, God has a plan for your life, He has a purpose for your life. There's a destiny. And so it's almost this idea that when you get saved, then all of a sudden destiny starts unfolding. But it's much, much more complicated than that, much more complex. Because destiny is something that God doesn't show you all at once. It's little steps, and as you're following those little steps, you begin to move into destiny. You're developing things. You're developing skill sets, spiritual skill sets. You're developing things that you didn't have before. It's a whole different set of tools. Yeah. And often what happens is people take their old tools and they try to repurpose them in the kingdom of God, which they don't work, because everything's backwards. The paradox of Christianity. You have to lose your life in order to find it. And so that applies right across the board. So all the tools you've been using to build your life with, well, you can't use those anymore, because the tools now that you're going to build your life with are tools that are actually going to cause you to lose your life. Mm-hmm. So it's a whole different tool set. And so the idea, to try to answer the question, what is, where's the source of that, what causes us to believe in ourselves, that there's, that we can be something. It's I'm not sure how to articulate that, to be honest, because it's multifaceted.
Let me interject another question, specifically to destiny. Maybe that you can think that through at the same time if you're able to do that. But the idea of destiny being misunderstood. Why? What is it about destiny that's misunderstood? I understand.
Well, one of the things that's on the forefront of my mind when it comes to, particularly when you're talking about the Christian man, and that is the definition of a real man. A real man is a Christian man, but that doesn't get us any closer to a definition. And so, because what is a Christian man now needs to be answered. But and I'm trying to do that, by giving the big picture. Of life and where we fit into all of that. It's not so cut and dry. It's not just, do these three things. I've noticed these books that are coming out lately is that it used to be, 3 steps to success, and now it's 35 steps to success. It's taking a lot longer, in books to get to success. And I think it's because the reality of life has become so much more, complicated, and it isn't as simple as 3 steps and things like that. And but the idea of trying to put all this together into an ideal person, not so much an ideal, but having a frame of reference for all this. It really isn't, it's. I can speak out of my own experience that it's the school of hard knocks. I mean, it really is. It's the school of hard knocks that help you to be able to have that confidence I can be something. It's actually a thought that I'm working through sermon wise. That is for me one of the greatest things about becoming a Christian is doing things that I couldn't do before. But the foundational element of that was the idea that when I got saved, I was already doing things, that I couldn't do before. I stopped smoking, I stopped drinking, I stopped partying, I stopped doing all that stuff without even trying to stop. I just stopped. And then I really, all I needed to do was to recognize and understand the nature of temptation. And then once I understood the nature of temptation, then overcoming became easier and easier. Because I knew that there would be, a temptation to quit, a temptation, to think this is too hard, those kinds of things. And when I could see those things as just temptations and no longer actual realistic boundaries or limitations, then all of a sudden it was like, whoa, what can I do next? And it was like the sky was the limit. So that has to be there, and it comes through overcoming temptation, which is what I'm talking about when I talk about the school of hard knocks, because it's overcoming difficulties, overcoming obstacles, that get in your way, that help you to develop the possibility. And God does that. That's how God works in us, is that God's idea is for us to just get little victories. We get little victories, and then we discover, hey, I got this victory. Maybe I can step it up a little more and a little more and a little more. And then God takes you more and more and more, to where you can overcome, and you're actually being effective, and you have influence, and people are listening to what you have to say. And, and that's happened over the years, my life, being a Christian, starting at 21 years old and now up to 62 years old. It's a real exciting thing to be able to look back and to think, wow, how much influence my life has, over the years. And it's funny because it's ironic, because it's like a miracle, but yet because of all the influence that I've had, it's like, well, I wish I had more influence in this, or I wish I had more influence in that, or the other thing, which years ago would have been a dream. Now it's like, how come I'm not getting this? What obstacles are in my way? What limitations do I need to overcome in order to be able to do that? And it's much more academic. It's not this gargantuan task, to be able to do things. It's everything gets to be, it's interesting how everything just gets to be more and more doable when you are doing.
Yeah.
So you have to do that. That's why I said the idea of being able to be adaptable, be able to make commitments, and then be responsible, in those commitments. Why those things I think are so key, because they develop you, because you're always going to be in over your head. The old saying, one rises to his own level of incompetence. And if you are rising, then you're gonna hit a wall. It's just part of it. You're gonna hit a wall. And so the good thing about hitting a wall is that now you have something to overcome, which is another hurdle in the race of life, that you're overcoming.
So we're at 7:57, and because you made this statement. I should just set my. I don't even know if you're able to do that. This works off the internet, so I have no idea if I'm able to just.
Well,
set the time.
It's a bug in Microsoft in Windows. It's literally a Windows problem.
But this is your clock. I have to go by this clock. I can't go by this one.
It's a Windows bug.
Okay, so this is my. It's a statement, more of a toss this on the table and get your thoughts. But because you mentioned a real man is a Christian man, so.
But then I'm trying to define
right,
a Christian man, and by issues of integrity, adaptability, all those kinds of things. Those are Christian things.
So there's a statement made by a pretty good source, I think generally, and so Solomon in the Bible is called the wisest man that ever lived, right? And so he wrote he's attributed for 3 books, most of 3 books in the Bible. Proverbs. But
he was also very cynical. So
right.
You have to
fair enough. But hear the statement though. So in his youth, he's attributed, scholars believe he
Right.
wrote the Song of Solomon in his youth.
Right.
And it's attributed to his middle years that he wrote Proverbs.
Okay.
And somewhere in between, in his vast experience of in the Middle Ages, and then it's believed that Ecclesiastes was written towards the end of his life.
Yeah.
The very last two verses of
Which
Ecclesiastes.
is where he's the most cynical, is
Yeah,
Ecclesiastes.
fair enough. Yeah, which is hilarious. But he concludes everything, and he actually makes a statement that I think this is just my own opinion, as I think that this is the only thing that Solomon says towards the end of his life, if that's when he wrote it, that gives me any hope that even had a decent, I'll call it a reunion with God, because he clearly went off in some other direction.
Yeah, I don't think he did.
But because he makes this statement, just hear me out here. But anyway, we're talking about being a man.
Yeah.
But he makes this statement in the last two verses he writes that he's attributed for writing, or credited for writing, is he says, "When all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and keep His commandments, because this is the whole duty of man." The word duty is actually added by scholars. So if you look at this like in the interlinear direct translation, it literally says this is the whole of man.
Yeah.
And then he says, "For God will bring every deed into judgment, along with every hidden thing, whether good or evil."
Yeah.
And so it's almost like you could sum this entire thing up. You're talking about adaptability.
Yeah.
Clearly, if this was your
but
MO,
your hand signal went like this. You can sum everything up. But actually, if you think about that, you can sum everything up.
Yes.
It goes the other way. It doesn't go this way. It goes this way.
Yeah.
Because there's so much to that.
I know. I was going to say, clearly that's a very complicated statement
the only
itself.
the only takeaway that you can take out of that, the only real takeaway that you can take out of that is that God is the center of the universe. I mean, that's all you can take away from that. You can't, but you're only defining location. You're not defining what is at the center of the universe. And so,
but I feel like you're kind of defining mindset,
because
though,
you're going keep His commandments, and it's keep His commandments because His commandments are not finite.
But can a man walk around with that as his mentality? That's my point. Can a man walk around with every situation he faces, fear God, keep His commandments, as being like his foundation for life?
Yeah, but what that means in every situation is
adaptable.
You can't define it, because
it would be unique to the situation, right?
Yeah, but because His commandments, and that's the problem with. So this is the problem with Bible language. And it's not the problem with the Bible itself. It's with the problem with, us blinded, limited thinking individuals, is we see a word like commandments and we think, what, 10, right? The 10 commandments, just 10. Well, when you get to know the Bible, you realize that not only are there 10, but there's like 613 additional ones to that. And then for each one of those, there are smaller, minute issues. Uh-huh. And when you go to read the book of Leviticus, and you realize if this happens like this, or it happens like that, or it happens like the other thing, then this thing happens. But if that doesn't happen, and then it has to happen this way, and it better be like this if it's like that, and if it's this thing and that thing. But if it's this thing and that thing, but not this thing, it has to be like this. But if it's not that thing and this thing, and it's this thing and that thing, and not this thing and that thing, and that thing and this thing and that thing, then it has to be like this. That's a commandment. Keep it. And you're like, what? How in the world am I going to know what to do when? Well, you're going to know what to do when happens. That's how you're going to know.
We need to like clip the last 30 seconds of this and turn it into a YouTube short. I think that would be very, very. I think that'd be a perfect short. That'd actually be a great advertisement for the podcast.
Talk to Catalan.
Yeah, Catalan. Yes, you got to clip that piece.
Catalan,
just that last like 30 seconds.
Make that into a short.
But hold on though, because
that's the problem. Is that, so when you read a sentence and it says keep His commandments, you're not actually including what was in Solomon's mind.
So okay, perfect. Yeah. So I'm really glad you said that, because honestly, I wasn't thinking about it in that context. You clearly got that better than I did. But so when I read that, when I was thinking about this because this is a scripture I actually was thinking about along with studying for this podcast and putting it together. I was thinking about it from my own experience, that it wasn't following a set of strict rules. It was in every situation, God, what do you want me to do here?
Yes,
How do you
exactly.
want me to act? And
Exactly.
that's helped me be adaptable in different
Exactly.
situations.
Exactly. And so that's fear God.
Yeah.
But now keep his commandments means you have to find out what is the definition of, for that scenario, that fears God.
Right.
So I fear God. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means in every circumstance in life, you're looking to do what we call his commandments, which isn't like I said, it isn't a finite amount. It isn't that there's so many. This is why Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments.
Yeah.
Well, what were his commandments? Tell me Jesus' commandments.
Yeah.
What were they? Only two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Very simple.
Pretty well defined, if you ask me. There's no definition there at all.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? What is my whole mind?
Yeah.
What is my whole strength? What is my, what does that look like? What does that look like in this particular circumstance?
Yeah.
And so it's, you can't think of it from the standpoint of reduction. You have to think of it in terms of expansion. And that really is what a good man is. A good man, here, I'll give you a definition of a good man. A good man is always getting better.
Yeah.
That's a good man. He's always getting better. You don't, there's not a plateau, that this is where a good man, you're a good man when you get to this plateau. No, a good man is always getting better. And always getting better changes. The definition of that, always, it changes.
Catalin, last 15 seconds is another one. It's a good one-liner, man. Come on. These are perfect. These are, I can't mark these down and I don't have the timestamps here. These are perfect. Anyway, okay, yeah, so very good. We're at time. I didn't open it up for off-topic questions. We'll get to those next week, but yeah.
Was there any off-topic?
No. If they were in, I would have said them, but I didn't actually mention them. So apologies. Next week we will open it up again for off-topic, getting back into the routine, or I should say the structure of.
Are you closing it?
So, yeah, this is it. Do you have anything
No.
else you want to say? That last statement was a great mic drop. I just want to close off with that. So that was good. All right. Anyway, thanks again for joining tonight. And if you're watching us after the fact, thank you. We appreciate that you guys view the podcast, and well, we'd love it if you shout this out to other people. We're not a monetized channel, so we're not doing this for anything other than to be a resource to people in general. And so if you know people that you think would be helped by our podcast, send the link out, and let us know if you have questions, comments. You can use the comment section afterwards. Appreciate you guys joining live, and we will be here again next week. We hope to have you join us again. Have a good night.